Big Shaq walked into the bank to withdraw his own money. Minutes later, security treated him like a criminal. Hours later, he discovered his name was being used in a billion-dollar fraud. Days later, he found out he was the CEO of the bank, without ever signing a contract. Now Shaquille O'Neal is about to expose the truth. But the people who set him up, they don't go down without a fight. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us, where are you watching from? Share in the comments below. A crisp Atlanta morning bathed the city in golden light as Shaquille O'Neal stepped out of his sleek black SUV. The streets hummed with life, honking cars, hurried pedestrians, the distant wail of a siren. Downtown's skyline loomed above, polished glass buildings reflecting the rising sun. Dressed in a dark hoodie and casual sweats, Big Shaq adjusted his sunglasses, his towering frame commanding attention, even when he wasn't trying. The grand structure of Fidelity National Bank stood in front of him, one of the most prestigious financial institutions in the city. Shaq had been banking here for years. No special treatment, no red carpet service, just a simple place to handle his finances. Today, all he needed was a withdrawal. Simple. Routine. Inside, the bank bustled with early morning customers. Businessmen in tailored suits, an elderly woman counting her cash at the counter, a young mother bouncing a fussy toddler on her hip. The air carried the familiar scent of polished wood and freshly printed money. Shaq stepped into the queue, nodding at a few people who recognized him but respected his space. "Next in line, please." A young teller with neatly combed hair and square glasses motioned him forward. His name tag read, Daniel, and he had the polite but impersonal smile of someone who followed bank protocol to the letter. As Shaq approached, the man's eyes flickered with recognition. "You're..." Daniel's voice caught. "You're Shaquille O'Neal." Shaq grinned. He was used to this reaction. "That's me." Daniel chuckled nervously. "Wow, welcome, sir. How can I help you today?" "Just need to make a withdrawal." Shaq pulled out his wallet, sliding his ID and banking details across the counter. He tapped the counter playfully. "Should be easy, right?" Daniel nodded, still starstruck as he typed into the system. But then, his fingers hesitated. His smile dimmed, his eyes narrowed at the screen. Shaq noticed the change immediately. "Something wrong?" Just a sec." Daniel forced a neutral expression, but Shaq could see the shift in his demeanor. He stole a quick glance toward a senior banker a few desks away. Shaq followed his gaze. The senior banker, a sharp-featured man in a charcoal gray suit, was reviewing a document when Daniel subtly motioned to him. The man frowned, adjusted his tie, and walked over. His name tag read, Mr. Reynolds, a name Shaq had never seen before, even after years of banking here. Reynolds barely glanced at him before peering at the computer screen. His expression darkened. He murmured something to Daniel, who nodded stiffly before stepping back. Shaq's patience thinned. "Look, what's going on?" Reynolds finally acknowledged him. "Mr. O'Neal, I'm afraid there's a discrepancy with your account." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "Discrepancy? What kind of discrepancy?" Reynolds clasped his hands in front of him. "We're unable to authorize your withdrawal at this time." Silence settled between them. A tense, uncomfortable silence. Shaq frowned. "That doesn't make sense. I've been banking here for years. My money's in that account." "I understand, sir, but our system doesn't currently reflect that information." A flicker of irritation crossed Shaq's face. He leaned in slightly. "So what does your system say?" Reynolds hesitated. A second too long. Shaq's chest tightened. Something wasn't right. Reynolds cleared his throat. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step aside while we investigate." Shaq let out a short laugh, one of disbelief. "Step aside? My own money is sitting in this bank, and you're telling me you need to investigate before I can touch it?" Reynolds remained composed, but there was an edge to his voice now. "I'm simply following protocol." Mr. O'Neal Shaq's gaze swept across the bank. Customers were watching now, some pretending not to stare. A man in a suit leaned over to whisper something to his colleague. A woman holding a designer handbag gave Shaq a wary glance before shifting away. He knew that look, the look people gave when they made assumptions. Shaq took a breath, keeping his voice steady. I don't care about your protocol. I have identification. I have my account details. Either you fix this mistake or tell me exactly why I can't access my own money. Reynolds glanced over Shaq's shoulder. Shaq followed his line of sight to the bank's security guard standing near the entrance. The guard, a burly man with a thick mustache, tilted his head slightly, waiting for a cue. Shaq exhaled slowly, realization sinking in. They weren't just denying him his money. They were treating him like a problem, like a threat. "Sir," Reynolds said, his tone cool and firm, "if you refuse to cooperate, I'll have to ask you to leave." Shaq's jaw tightened. "Cooperate?" He forced a chuckle, shaking his head. "I came here to withdraw my own money, and somehow I'm the one being difficult?" A shift in the room. A mother pulled her child closer. A man by the ATM looked up from his phone. Shaq felt the weight of their stares. A younger banker, a woman with dark brown hair tied back in a bun, hesitated behind the counter, her eyes flickering between the screen and Shaq. She looked nervous, like she wanted to say something but didn't dare. Reynolds straightened his tie. "Sir, please step aside." The security guard took a step forward. Shaq had been in situations like this before. He knew how fast things could spiral. If he pushed too hard, they'd twist the story. Suddenly, he wouldn't be a man trying to access his own account. He'd be an aggressive customer causing a disturbance. He had nothing to prove. And yet standing there being watched like he didn't belong, the humiliation gnawed at him. He glanced at the young banker again. She quickly looked away. Reynolds' voice remained level. "Sir, if you don't leave now, we'll have to involve law enforcement." A long, heavy pause. Shaq inhaled deeply. He didn't fear the police, but he wasn't about to let this turn into a public spectacle. He wasn't going to give them what they wanted, an excuse. He nodded once, slow and controlled. "All right." With a final glance at Reynolds, he turned on his heel and walked toward the exit. The security guard didn't move, but he kept a close watch. Shaq pushed through the glass doors, stepping onto the sunlit sidewalk. Beneath the warm morning light, his blood ran cold. Something was very, very wrong. Shaq stood outside Fidelity National Bank, staring at the glass doors as they slowly slid shut behind him. His pulse was steady, controlled, but his mind raced. The Atlanta sun was warm against his skin, but the chill of what had just happened still clung to him. He took a slow breath, trying to make sense of it. How could his account ownership be in question? He had been banking here for years, making deposits, handling transactions, doing everything by the book. He wasn't some random guy walking in off the street. He was Shaquille O'Neal. His face had been on billboards, TV screens, and even cereal boxes. How in the world could they think his identity was in question? He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contact list before pressing a name. The call rang twice before a deep, familiar voice answered. "Shaq, everything good?" It was Jeremiah Cole, his financial advisor for over a decade. If anyone could figure this out, it was him. "Nah, man, something's off," Shaq said, rubbing the back of his head. "I just tried to make a withdrawal, and they told me I don't own my own damn account." A pause. Then, "Wait, what?" "They said my ID doesn't match the account records." Jeremiah's tone sharpened. "That's impossible. I reviewed everything just last month. Nothing was wrong." "Well, they're saying otherwise." Jeremiah exhaled. "All right, stay put. I'll make some calls." Shaq ended the call and turned back toward the bank. Through the glass, he saw the same teller, Daniel, standing stiffly behind the counter, eyes darting toward the back offices. The manager, Reynolds, was gone, probably making himself scarce now that things had escalated. Shaq wasn't about to let this go. He squared his shoulders and stepped back inside. The air in the bank felt different now, heavier. Customers still moved about, but there was an unspoken tension. A few people glanced at him, their eyes holding something new, doubt. He walked back to the counter, planting both hands down with deliberate weight. Daniel looked up and immediately tensed. "I need to speak to someone," Shaq said evenly. "Now." Daniel swallowed, glancing around like he wanted to disappear. "Sir, I don't know if I can—" "Find someone who can," Shaq said. Before Daniel could respond, another voice cut in. Mr. O'Neill Shaq turned to see a woman in her late 40s, her blonde hair pulled into a tight bun. She wore a navy blue suit with a silver Fidelity National Bank pin gleaming on her lapel. Her badge read, Elaine Trask, Senior Account Specialist. "We need to discuss this matter in private," she said. Shaq studied her for a moment before nodding. "Fine." She led him through a side door into a sleek office with a glass table and modern leather chairs. The air smelled like expensive cologne and disinfectant. Elaine sat down across from him and folded her hands. "Mr. O'Neill, I understand your frustration, but there seems to be a discrepancy with your account records." "Yeah, I got that part already," Shaq said, leaning forward. "What kind of discrepancy?" Elaine tapped at a tablet screen, swiping through data. "According to our system, the credentials you provided do not match the account owner's details." Shaq's patience thinned. "That doesn't make sense. My ID, my account number, my signature, it's all there." Elaine met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Your name is attached to the account, yes. But according to our records, you are not listed as the primary owner." A slow, unnerving silence stretched between them. Shaq frowned. "Then who the hell is?" Elaine hesitated. For the first time, her composed demeanor cracked. She didn't have an answer. "I'll need to look into that further," she said carefully. Shaq clenched his jaw. "You're telling me that someone else owns my account, but you don't know who." Elaine pursed her lips. "What I'm saying, Mr. O'Neill, is that there is conflicting information, and until we verify everything, we cannot release any funds to you." Something cold slid down Shaq's spine. "This sounds a lot like you're accusing me of something," he said. Elaine exhaled. "I assure you this is purely procedural. We take identity fraud very seriously." Shaq let out a slow laugh, one of disbelief. "You think I stole my own identity?" "I'm not saying that. You're treating me like it." Elaine didn't respond. A sharp knock at the door interrupted the silence. The door cracked open, and a security guard stepped in. It was the same one from earlier, the one who had been watching. "Everything all right in here?" he asked, though his stance suggested he was prepared to step in if needed. Shaq exhaled through his nose, forcing himself to stay calm. "We're good." Elaine offered a tight smile. "Thank you, Travis. You can wait outside." The guard hesitated before stepping back and closing the door. Shaq turned back to Elaine. "Let's cut the bull. Either fix this, or tell me exactly who made this change to my account." Elaine stood. "I'll need some time to investigate." Shaq stood too, towering over her. "You've got until the end of the day." Elaine's professional mask slipped for just a second, just enough for Shaq to see the unease beneath it. Without another word, he turned and walked out. The bank felt even more suffocating now. Eyes flicked toward him, but no one said a word. As he passed the row of desks, a movement caught his eye. A young woman, mid-20s, dark brown hair, pale blue blouse, quickly looked away when he met her gaze. She knows something. Shaq slowed his pace. The woman hesitated, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. Then, in the smallest motion, she glanced at a side hallway, just a flicker of her eyes, before returning to her screen. A silent message. Shaq got it. He turned and strode toward the hallway. The corridor led past private offices, quieter than the rest of the bank. A minute later, soft footsteps followed. Then, "Mr. O'Neill," she whispered. Shaq turned. The woman looked over her shoulder before stepping closer. I shouldn't be talking to you, but..." She swallowed hard. "Something weird is happening with your account." Shaq's muscles tensed. "Explain." She shook her head. "I don't know the full story, but your profile isn't locked. It's been redirected." Shaq narrowed his eyes. "Redirected where?" She hesitated. "I don't know. But the system isn't flagging it as a normal block. It's been moved." Shaq's chest tightened. "Someone tampered with my account." She nodded. "And I think it was done internally." The words settled heavy between them. The woman glanced around. "I need to get back before they notice I'm gone." She started to step away, then hesitated. "For what it's worth, I don't think this was a mistake." Shaq exhaled slowly. "I don't think so either." She turned and hurried back toward her desk. Shaq ran a hand down his face. This wasn't just a banking error. This was deliberate. Someone inside Fidelity National Bank had rerouted his account, and that meant someone inside the bank didn't want him to know why. But Shaq wasn't the kind of man to let things slide. Whoever was behind this, they had no idea who they were messing with. Shaq's financial advisor, Jeremiah, had called him back earlier, but had no immediate answers. His account was still listed yet inaccessible. But what haunted him most wasn't the account itself. It was the way that young employee had looked at him before she whispered those words. I don't think this was a mistake. Something was off. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight. His phone buzzed against the table, the vibration cutting through the silence. Unknown number. Shaq frowned. He normally didn't answer calls this late, especially unknown ones. But something in his gut told him this wasn't random. He picked up. Yeah? A nervous breath came through the line. Then, a whisper. Mr. O'Neill, it's me. Leah. From the bank. Shaq straightened in his chair. Leah Simmons, the same young woman who had warned him. He kept his voice calm but firm. Leah, you better have a good reason for calling me this late. I do, she said quickly. I wasn't sure if I should, but after today, I couldn't just stay quiet. Shaq leaned forward. Talk. I went back into the system, Leah continued, her voice lower now, almost like she was afraid someone would hear her. Your account, it isn't frozen. Shaq's brow furrowed. What do you mean? The manager said. They lied, Leah cut in. Your account isn't locked or under review. It's just not under your name anymore. Silence hung in the air between them. Shaq's grip tightened around his phone. Then whose name is it under? Leah hesitated. That's the thing. The system still lists your name. Just not as the owner. Shaq's jaw tensed. Then what am I listed as? The next words out of Leah's mouth sent a chill through him. You're listed as the CEO of the bank. Shaq didn't move, didn't breathe. For the first time all day, he felt completely off balance. I had to double check, Leah stammered. I thought maybe it was a glitch, but it's real. In the executive database, you're listed as the acting CEO of Fidelity National Bank. Shaq finally found his voice. That doesn't make any damn sense. I know, Leah whispered. It's not just your account. Your name has been inserted into multiple financial authorizations, high-level contracts, and internal documents. And the strangest part? This wasn't updated today or yesterday. It was done 2 weeks ago. Shaq rubbed a hand down his face. 2 weeks ago? He had been overseas at that time. He hadn't signed any contracts, hadn't met with anyone from the bank, hadn't even so much as thought about taking a position there. And yet here he was, officially listed as the head of an institution he had no connection to. His mind raced. Who was CEO before me? Leah was silent for a moment. The last registered CEO, Howard Klein, resigned exactly 2 weeks ago, the same day your name was added. Shaq felt something click in his mind. A setup, a cover-up. Someone had done this on purpose. You said my name was added to contracts, he said. What kind of contracts? Leah hesitated again. That's the part that worries me. Shaq exhaled sharply. Leah, spill. The contracts linked to your name aren't normal banking documents. They're tied to major wire transfers, offshore holdings, and executive loan approvals. Some of these transactions are... She stopped, then lowered her voice further. Some of these are illegal. Shaq felt his stomach twist. This is why they stopped you at the bank, Leah continued. They weren't protecting your money. They were protecting themselves. They thought you found out. Shaq gripped the arm of his chair. You're telling me someone put my name on criminal transactions? Yes, Leah said. And if someone digs deep enough, you'll be the one holding the bag for it. Shaq closed his eyes, his mind piecing everything together. Whoever was behind this had power. They had rerouted his account, changed corporate documents, and buried him inside a multi-million-dollar conspiracy without his knowledge. He had walked into that bank today, thinking it was just a simple withdrawal issue. But this was something much bigger. And someone, Someone inside that bank had orchestrated the whole thing. Shaq took a slow breath, forcing himself to think clearly. How much trouble am I in? Leah didn't answer right away. If the government or financial regulators look into this, it'll look like you were complicit, like you were running the operation. Shaq ran a hand over his face. You gotta be kidding me. I wish I was. Silence filled the line again, heavy and suffocating. Shaq could handle a lot. He had spent his whole life overcoming challenges, on and off the court. But this was different. This wasn't a game. This was fraud, corruption, criminal charges waiting to happen. Who has access to these records? He asked finally. The board of directors, Leah said, and high-level executives. Shaq's mind snapped back to Franklin Nash, the senior executive from earlier, the way he had looked at him in that boardroom, smug and calculating, like a man who knew more than he was letting on. Someone had set this up. And Nash? He was at the center of it. Shaq's voice dropped to a low rumble. Leah, listen to me carefully. Does anyone else know you're looking into this? No, she said quickly. I was careful. Good. Keep it that way. He leaned back, jaw tight. Can you send me the files? I'll try, Leah said. But if I pull too much, they'll know I'm snooping. Shaq nodded, even though she couldn't see him. Be careful. If you feel like you're being watched, stop. A pause. Then Leah sighed. Mr. O'Neill, I don't think they ever expected you to find out. But now that you have? Shaq's grip tightened around the phone. I don't think they're going to let this go. He didn't respond right away. He didn't have to. He already knew what was coming. This wasn't just about a blocked bank account anymore. This was about power, control. And whoever was behind it wasn't afraid to ruin a man's life to keep their secrets buried. Shaq had two choices. Walk away, hope this mess disappeared, or dig deeper and find out exactly who had the audacity to frame him. His decision was made before Leah even hung up. Shaquille O'Neal wasn't the kind of man who let things slide. And whoever was behind this, they had no idea who they were messing with. Shaq sat in his private study, the glow of his laptop screen illuminating the deep furrow in his brow. The call with Leah had changed everything. He wasn't just dealing with a simple banking issue. He had been set up. His name had been planted inside a corporate web of fraud, and someone was pulling the strings from the shadows. He tapped his fingers against the mahogany desk, his mind working through the possibilities. Whoever had done this had power, serious power, and had assumed he would never find out. That was their first mistake. He picked up his phone and dialed Jeremiah Cole, his longtime financial advisor. The phone barely rang twice before Jeremiah answered. Shaq, I was just about to call you. Something weird's going on with your account, man. Shaq exhaled. Yeah, no kidding. You get anything? I had my team pull the most recent filings. As of 2 weeks ago, you are listed as the acting CEO of Fidelity National Bank. Shaq clenched his jaw. So it's not just some internal glitch. No glitch, Jeremiah confirmed. There's official paperwork with your name on it. Not just in the bank's internal system, but in the state's corporate registry. It's all legal, at least on paper. Shaq pushed back in his chair, his mind racing. Who filed it? That's where things get murky, Jeremiah said. The transition paperwork was submitted electronically, but the signature on the documents, it's yours. Shaq's stomach twisted. What? Not only that, Jeremiah continued, but it's notarized. It looks official, like you willingly signed off on taking this position. Shaq, if someone pulls these records, it'll look like you knowingly became CEO. Shaq ran a hand down his face. He had signed nothing, not even a phone call, an email, a conversation about taking any position at the bank. And yet, his name was sitting at the top of the executive roster. Tell me about the guy before me, Shaq said, his voice sharper now. The real CEO, Howard Klein. Jeremiah sighed. That's the other part that's weird. Klein resigned abruptly 2 weeks ago, the same day your name was added. No public statement, no press release, no explanation. Just walked away from a multi-million-dollar job like it was nothing. Shaq didn't believe in coincidences. You talked to him? I tried, Jeremiah said. He's off the grid. No social media activity, no press appearances. It's like he disappeared overnight. Shaq's chest tightened. Someone had forced Klein out, and then put Shaq's name in his place. You ever hear of a CEO resigning with no press statement? Shaq asked. Jeremiah scoffed. Not unless they were forced out, or trying to avoid getting caught in something ugly. Shaq's stomach twisted again. You saying this guy was dirty? I don't know. But someone made sure he left quietly, and now somehow you're holding the bag. Shaq stayed silent, his mind running through every angle. Jeremiah sighed again. Look, man, we need to get legal on this now. If this thing blows up, you could be looking at financial crime charges, embezzlement, fraud. Even if you didn't do a damn thing, your name is all over these transactions. Shaq didn't respond right away. He wasn't scared, but he was angry. Someone had orchestrated this down to the finest detail. They had planted his name where it didn't belong, covered their tracks, and probably laughed to themselves thinking a former basketball player wouldn't know how to fight back. Their second mistake. I'll handle the legal side, Shaq said finally, but I need to know who did this, and why. I get it, Jeremiah said, but whoever did this, they have resources, the kind of people that don't make mistakes. Shaq's jaw tightened. Good, neither do I. The next morning, Shaq walked into Coleman and Weathers, one of the top corporate law firms in Atlanta. He had worked with them before, and he trusted them. That trust was about to be tested. A sharp-suited man in his 50s, William Bill Weathers, led him into a private conference room. The walls were lined with sleek bookshelves, and a long glass table stretched across the room. Bill sat across from Shaq and folded his hands. Jeremiah filled me in. This is bad, Shaq. Shaq exhaled, resting his elbows on the table. I need answers, Bill. Real ones. Bill nodded. We did a deep dive into the corporate filings. Your name isn't just on the CEO paperwork. It's attached to multiple financial transactions, and not small ones. We're talking high-level international wire transfers, investor agreements, and... He glanced at the file in front of him. A restructuring deal that liquidated over $50 million in assets. Shaq's grip tightened around his coffee cup. Someone had used his name to move money. A lot of it. And let me guess, Shaq said, his voice low. There's no trace of who actually did it? Bill sighed. There's a paper trail, but it's layered through shell companies and offshore accounts. Every time we think we've hit a source, it leads to another dead end. Shaq leaned back, staring at the ceiling. Someone had spent a lot of time and money making sure this couldn't be traced back to them. Tell me about the board of directors, Shaq said suddenly. Who's really running this bank? Bill flipped through another document. There are 8 board members, standard mix of corporate executives, investors, and attorneys. But one name stood out, Franklin Nash. Shaq's eyes darkened. He had met Nash briefly at the bank, smug, condescending, acting like he owned the place. What do you have on him? Bill looked up. Powerful, connected, and untouchable, so far. He slid a paper across the table. He's been a board member for years, but the weird part? He has no banking background. His expertise is in... Shaq picked up the paper and read the line aloud. Corporate crisis management. Bill nodded grimly. Exactly. He's the guy companies bring in when they need to, make problems disappear. Shaq exhaled sharply. And right now, I'm the problem. Bill didn't disagree. Shaq sat in silence for a moment. He had faced tough opponents before, guys who would do anything to win, who played dirty, who bent the rules. But this wasn't the NBA. This was real life. He wasn't going to be anyone's pawn. What's my next move? Shaq asked. Bill leaned forward. We need to get ahead of this. If this goes public, you could be hit with legal action before we even figure out who's behind it. We need to quietly gather more intel. And fast. Shaq's gaze hardened. I don't do quiet. Bill smirked. Yeah, I figured. Shaq stood up. Find me something, Bill. Anything that leads back to Nash and his people. Bill nodded. And you? Shaq's expression darkened. I'm gonna pay Mr. Nash a visit. As Shaq walked out of the law firm, the weight of the situation settled on his shoulders. Someone had tried to play him. They thought they had orchestrated the perfect crime, leaving him to take the fall. But they had made one final mistake. They forgot who they were dealing with. And Shaq? He wasn't going down without a fight. The morning air was thick with humidity as Shaq stepped out of his SUV, his massive frame casting a shadow over the sidewalk in front of Fidelity National Bank's corporate headquarters. The sleek mirrored glass of the towering building reflected the bustling streets of downtown Atlanta. Shaq didn't hesitate. No appointment, no permission, no time for games. Inside, the lobby was a pristine corporate landscape. High ceilings, modern art installations, and an air of controlled professionalism. Until Shaq walked in. The receptionist, a young woman with headset and clipboard in hand, froze as soon as she recognized him. Mr. O'Neill, do you have an appointment? Shaq didn't slow down. I don't need one. Two uniformed security guards near the entrance exchanged glances before stepping forward. Sir, we can't let you proceed without clearance. One of them placed a hand on his belt, not reaching for anything, but making his presence known. Shaq stopped just short of them, his deep voice even. You gonna tell your CEO he's not allowed in his own building? Confusion flickered in their expressions. One of them muttered something into a radio, but Shaq was already moving past them. Through the glass walls of the executive wing, he spotted a high-level board meeting in progress. A long conference table filled with men and women in expensive suits, laptops open, documents spread out. At the head of the table sat Franklin Nash. Shaq pushed open the glass doors without knocking. The room fell silent. All eyes snapped toward him. Some of them widened in shock. Others darted toward Nash, waiting for his reaction. Shaq planted his hands firmly on the table, towering over the executives. He let the silence stretch just long enough to make them uncomfortable. Then, in a voice calm but carrying undeniable authority, he said, So, I'm your CEO. Mind explaining how that happened? A few of the board members shifted in their seats. Some whispered amongst themselves, exchanging nervous glances. They weren't expecting him to walk in here. They weren't expecting him to know. Franklin Nash, however, didn't flinch. Dressed in a charcoal suit with a pocket square that probably cost more than some people's rent, Nash leaned back in his chair and smirked. Mr. O'Neill, he said smoothly. What a surprise. Shaq met his gaze, unblinking. Not for me. A thin, forced chuckle escaped Nash's lips. Gentlemen, let's take a brief recess. No one moved. No one spoke. Nash's smirk faded. Now. Chairs scraped against the floor as the board members gathered their files and exited quickly, some avoiding eye contact as they walked past Shaq. In seconds, it was just the two of them. Shaq standing tall, Nash seated, still exuding that irritating confidence. Shaq pulled out a chair at the table's edge, the wood groaning under his weight. He didn't sit back. He leaned forward, resting his arms on the surface. You want to explain to me why my name is listed as CEO of this bank? Nash folded his hands in front of him, measuring his words. It was necessary. Shaq's brows shot up. Necessary? For who? Nash sighed, as if this whole conversation was an inconvenience. You weren't supposed to find out. Shaq's patience snapped. Well, I did. His voice lowered, the weight of his words pressing against the room. So now you're going to tell me exactly what's going on. Nash tilted his head slightly. Or what? Shaq didn't blink. Or I start making calls. A flicker of something passed over Nash's face, annoyance, maybe even concern. But it was gone just as quickly. Fine, Nash said. He leaned back, tapping a single finger against the table. Let's be clear about one thing first. You were never supposed to have any actual control here. Your name, your status, it was a shield, a public image. That's all. Shaq let that sink in. A shield for what? Nash exhaled like a man burdened by explaining something to a child. We needed a transition period. Howard Klein had to be moved out, quietly. Too many questions would have been asked if we appointed one of our own immediately. Shaq's jaw tightened. And what did Klein do that made him such a liability? Nash finally met his gaze head on. He started asking the wrong questions, just like you are now. A slow realization settled in Shaq's gut. Klein hadn't resigned. He had been forced out, And the people in this room had been the ones to do it. You used my name, Shaq said, his voice colder now. For what? Nash exhaled through his nose. A simple restructuring move. Certain financial adjustments needed to be made. Your status made that process easier. Shaq's fingers curled into fists. Financial adjustments? You mean illegal transactions? Nash smirked again. Illegal is such a strong word. Shaq's nostrils flared. Try the right one. Nash sighed, drumming his fingers against the polished wood. Here's what you don't understand, Shaquille. Banks like this, they don't run on clean money. They run on power moves, connections, silent deals that make the whole system work. And people like me? He spread his arms. We keep it all moving smoothly. Shaq shook his head, his voice edged with quiet fury. And people like me? You think we just let you use us? Nash let the question hang for a moment. If you know what's good for you? He leaned forward now, voice dropping to something almost like a whisper. You do. Shaq's eyes darkened. There it was. The threat. Nash smiled thinly. You're a smart man, Shaq. You have influence, but this isn't basketball. This is a different kind of game. One you don't know how to play. Shaq let the words settle, his gaze unwavering. Then, in a voice dead calm, he said, You think I don't know how to play? The room fell silent. Shaq let his sighs fill the space, let his presence remind Nash exactly who he was dealing with. I've been underestimated my whole life, and every time someone thought they had me figured out, he leaned in just enough for Nash to feel the weight of his next words. I proved them wrong. Nash's smirk faltered. Shaq stood, the chair scraping against the floor. I'm not Klein. You're not going to push me out of my own name. Nash exhaled through his nose. And what exactly do you plan to do about it? Shaq pulled out his phone and tapped the screen. First, I make calls to the media, to my attorneys, to people who don't like banks pulling shady deals with stolen identities. Nash's jaw tensed. Shaq tilted his head. I may not know how to play your game, Nash, but I do know this. People love a scandal. And if you think for 1 second that I won't burn this place to the ground to clear my name, you don't know a damn thing about me. For the first time, Nash looked rattled. Shaq turned and strode toward the door. Before he stepped out, he paused. One last warning. Clock's ticking, Nash. Then he walked out, leaving behind a silence so thick it suffocated. Everything was coming into focus now. The fake CEO appointment. The missing Howard Klein. The buried financial transactions. They had set him up. A part of him had already suspected it. But hearing it from Franklin Nash himself, seeing the smug look on his face when he admitted to using Shaq as a cover, that lit something inside of him. A slow-burning anger that wouldn't go away. He pulled out his phone and called Jeremiah. The line rang twice before the deep, familiar voice answered. You talked to Nash? Shaq exhaled sharply. Yeah, and it's worse than we thought. He could hear Jeremiah shifting in his chair. How bad? Shaq rested his arm on the window. They've been moving money, millions, through fake investments, offshore accounts. Klein found out, and they made him disappear. Then they put my name on everything. They needed someone the public wouldn't question. A beat of silence. Then, Shaq, they're trying to pin this on you. Shaq's grip tightened. I know. This isn't just fraud, man, Jeremiah said. This is federal crime territory. Money laundering at this scale, that's prison time. Shaq closed his eyes for a brief moment, letting the weight of it settle in. They picked the wrong guy. The next morning, Shaq walked back into Coleman and Weathers' law firm. He didn't have an appointment, but at this point that didn't matter. Bill Weathers looked up from his desk as Shaq entered his office, a grim expression already set on his face. I was about to call you. Shaq dropped into the chair across from him. You find something? Bill nodded, pushing a folder across the desk. Shaq flipped it open. Inside were pages of financial records, wire transfers, and legal documents. The same paperwork Leah had hinted at. Only now, the full picture was clear. Over the last year, Bill began, Fidelity has been rerouting funds from legitimate corporate clients into shell companies. From there, The money gets funneled into overseas accounts before disappearing. It's classic laundering. Shaq's eyes moved across the names on the documents. Some he recognized: high-profile businessmen, real estate moguls, even political donors. These people knew, he muttered. Bill nodded. And they didn't just use your name, they used your trust. You were the perfect cover. Clean public image. No history of financial crime and too high profile for anyone to question. Shaq exhaled slowly. They planned to let me take the fall when this all came out. They still might, Bill said. If this goes public, the first name investigators are going to see is yours, not Nash's, not the board's, yours. Shaq leaned back, pressing a hand against his forehead. He had spent his entire life building his reputation, from the courts to business, philanthropy, entertainment. And now, with just a few forged documents, these people were ready to tear it all down just to protect themselves. A slow, quiet anger settled in his chest. They think I won't fight back, Shaq muttered. Bill exhaled. No, Shaq. They think you won't win. That night, Shaq sat alone in his office, documents spread out across his desk. His mind was racing. What was the next move? A notification popped up on his phone. A text from Leah Simmons. Meet me. 20 minutes. No calls, no tracking. Sending location. A pin dropped onto his screen, a small coffee shop in Midtown. Shaq hesitated for only a second before grabbing his keys. The coffee shop was nearly empty when Shaq walked in. Leah was already at a back booth, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup. She looked nervous. Shaq slid into the seat across from her. Talk. She glanced around before lowering her voice. I kept digging. I shouldn't have, but... She shook her head. You need to know how deep this goes. She pulled out a USB drive and slid it across the table. Everything is on there. Internal memos, emails, transaction histories, stuff that was deleted from the system. Shaq picked it up. You could get fired for this. Leah let out a dry laugh. Fired? If Nash finds out I pulled this, I won't just lose my job, I'll disappear. Shaq's stomach clenched. What do you mean? Leah leaned in. You asked about Howard Klein, about why he left so suddenly. She swallowed hard. Shaq, he didn't just resign, he's gone. No paper trail, no public record, just gone. Shaq sat back, the full weight of her words hitting him. If they could do that to Klein, Leah whispered, what do you think they'd do to you? The next morning, Shaq got a call he didn't expect. Franklin Nash. He let it ring twice before answering. Mr. O'Neill. Nash's voice was smooth as ever. We should talk. Shaq leaned against his desk. That's funny. I was thinking the same thing. A slight chuckle. Good. Then I'll send a car. Shaq's lips curled into a small smirk. No need. I'll come to you. The private suite inside a high-rise hotel in downtown Atlanta was exactly what Shaq expected. Luxurious, expensive, and untouchable. Nash sat in an armchair near a stocked bar, sipping whiskey as Shaq stepped inside. Nash gestured to a chair. Drink? Shaq ignored the offer and took a seat across from him. Nash smirked. Straight to business. I respect that. Shaq folded his arms. Cut the act. You called me. So talk. Nash set his glass down. I assume by now you've realized what's really happening. The bank, the transactions, the board's involvement. Shaq didn't respond. Nash leaned forward. So here's what I'm offering. A way out. Shaq's jaw tensed. You don't want this fight, Shaq. Nash continued. You're an athlete, a businessman, a celebrity. But this? He gestured vaguely. This is politics. This is power. You're out of your league. Shaq chuckled. That why you needed my name to clean up your mess? Nash's smirk faltered for a split second. Shaq leaned in. You knew the money trail was getting too hot. You knew Klein was about to expose you. So you got rid of him. You put my name on those transactions thinking I'd never look. Thinking I'd never fight back. Nash exhaled through his nose. And yet, here you are. Damn right. A pause. Then Nash shook his head. All right, let's stop pretending. You want the truth? Shaq didn't blink. We needed a face people trust. Who better than a billionaire athlete? Shaq stayed silent, letting Nash talk. "If you expose this, it won't end well for you," Nash said finally. His voice was softer now, more calculated. "There's too much money at stake, too many powerful names. You take this public and the system will crush you before it even touches me." Shaq studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, a smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "You know what the difference is between me and you, Nash?" Shaq asked. Nash raised an eyebrow. "I don't scare easy." Nash exhaled, picking up his whiskey again. "Then I hope you're ready for what comes next." Shaq stood. "So do I." Then he walked out, the war officially underway. And now, Shaq was the only person who could stop them. For a moment, he closed his eyes, letting the silence settle around him. He had spent his whole life as a fighter, on the court, in business, in life. But this was different. This wasn't a game. This was a war. And they had no idea what was coming. The next morning, Shaq sat across from Leah Simmons at a small diner just outside downtown Atlanta. It was the kind of place with sticky tabletops and burnt coffee, where no one paid attention to who was sitting in the corner booth. That's exactly what they needed. Leah looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes. "They're erasing everything," she said, stirring her coffee with a shaky hand. "I checked the system this morning. Files are disappearing. Financial reports, client records, transaction histories. It's all being wiped." Shaq nodded, expected as much. "That USB you gave me, how much of the data is still valid?" "Most of it," she said. "But if they get rid of the original documents, it'll be harder to prove." Shaq exhaled. They were covering their tracks fast. That meant Nash knew time was running out. "They're scared," he muttered. Leah scoffed. "I wish I could believe that." She looked around, lowering her voice. "I think they're on to me." Shaq's gaze sharpened. "What happened?" She hesitated. "My keycard was deactivated this morning. It told me it was a system error, but I don't think it was." Shaq's jaw clenched. They were starting to cut loose ends. Leah was a liability. And if she was in danger, that meant he was too. "You need to be careful," he said. Leah gave him a tired smile. "You too." Later that afternoon, Shaq's phone buzzed with a blocked number. He let it ring, watching the screen for a few seconds before answering. A distorted voice came through. "Walk away, Shaquille." Shaq's grip tightened. "Who is this?" A long pause. Then, "You don't want to make enemies in the wrong places." The line went dead. Shaq sat there for a moment, breathing slow and deep. They were watching. But if they thought a few anonymous calls would make him back down, they didn't know Shaquille O'Neal. The media turned on him first. It started as whispers. Business blogs questioning his sudden involvement in Fidelity National Bank. Then came the news segments. Shaq caught in a billion-dollar banking controversy. O'Neal at the center of a financial scandal. The board was playing their hand. They were controlling the narrative, making sure Shaq looked like the bad guy before he could expose the truth. The worst part? It was working. His social media blew up. Comments flooded in. "Man, I thought Shaq was better than this. Another celebrity caught in a shady business deal. Guess we never really know these guys, huh?" Shaq scrolled through the noise, jaw clenched. The court of public opinion was shifting, and the board was counting on that to bury him. They wanted him to panic. They wanted him to make mistakes. They wanted him to run. Instead, he called his attorney. Bill Weathers looked even more stressed than usual when Shaq walked into his office. "I'm guessing you've seen the news." Shaq dropped into the chair across from him. "Yeah." Bill rubbed his temple. "They're trying to discredit you before you can make a move. If you go public now, you'll look like a guilty man trying to clear his name. If you wait too long, they'll bury everything before we can expose them." Shaq leaned forward. "So what do we do?" Bill exhaled. "We find leverage." Shaq tapped his fingers against the desk. "The board is powerful, but they're not invincible. Someone on the inside has to be sweating right now." Bill nodded. "We just have to find the weak link." A week passed. Shaq stayed low, letting the media frenzy swirl around him. Leah kept digging where she could, passing him whatever information she could find. Then, a break. Jeremiah called him late at night. "We got something." Shaq sat up. "Talk to me." "I pulled financial records that aren't in the official system, stuff the board thought they wiped. And there's a name that keeps coming up, Patrick Langston." Shaq frowned. "Who's Langston?" "Senior accountant," Jeremiah said. "Not board level, but high enough to have seen what's been happening. And here's the interesting part. He suddenly put in his resignation last week." Shaq's pulse picked up. "You think he got cold feet?" "I think he knows something, and I think he's trying to get out before this whole thing collapses." Shaq didn't hesitate. "Where is he now?" Jeremiah sighed. "That's the bad news. He's missing." The next day, Shaq drove to Langston's last known address, a modest townhome on the outskirts of the city. He knocked. No answer. He tried again. Nothing. Then, just as he was about to leave, the door cracked open an inch. A pair of nervous eyes peeked through. "Langston." "Go away," he whispered. Shaq pressed a hand against the door. "I just want to talk." Langston shook his head. "I can't. I shouldn't even be here. They're watching me." Shaq kept his voice calm. "I know what they did. I know they forced Klein out. I know they laundered money. And I know they used my name to do it." Langston swallowed hard. "I don't know what you're talking about." Shaq stepped closer. "Yes, you do." A long silence. Then, finally, Langston opened the door. Inside, Langston paced the small living room, hands shaking. "I shouldn't be talking to you." Shaq leaned against the wall. "You're already in this. Running won't change that." Langston rubbed his face. "You don't understand. These people, they don't just fire you. They erase you." Shaq's chest tightened. "Howard Klein." "You want to disappear like him?" Shaq asked. Langston hesitated. "You help me," Shaq said, "and we take them down together." Langston met his gaze, fear still in his eyes. But beneath it, something else, resolve. A slow nod. Shaq exhaled. The silent war was over. It was time to fight back. Shaq sat in the back of a dimly lit newsroom, his massive frame squeezed into a chair that was clearly not built for someone his size. Across from him, Sarah Whitmore, an award-winning investigative journalist, stared at the screen of her laptop, scrolling through the mountains of evidence he had just handed over. Emails, wire transfers, shell company formations, internal memos. The entire fraudulent web that Franklin Nash and the board of directors had spun to launder money and shift the blame onto him. Sarah let out a low whistle. "This is insane." Shaq folded his arms. "Tell me something I don't know." She shook her head, eyes still glued to the screen. "Shaq, this isn't just a bank scandal. This is federal crime territory. If this goes public, we're talking SEC violations, money laundering charges, even RICO violations." "Good," Shaq said. "Let them sweat." Sarah looked up. "You realize they're going to fight back, right? This story drops, and they'll throw everything at you. Legal teams, PR firms, even threats. Nash isn't the kind of guy to just roll over." Shaq leaned forward, his voice calm but edged with steel. "Sarah, these people stole my name, my identity. They thought I'd just let it happen." He shook his head. "They forgot who I am." Sarah studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, let's burn this place down." She started typing. Within hours, the biggest financial scandal of the year hit the news. The first wave of coverage was explosive. Shaquille O'Neal caught in corporate corruption scandal, or was he set up? Bank fraud at the highest level, CEO scheme exposed. Leaked documents show financial manipulation within Fidelity National Bank. The internet erupted. Social media was on fire. People who had doubted Shaq before suddenly flipped. Wait, so Shaq was framed? Damn, that's crazy. Man, this dude just wanted to get his own money and ended up exposing a whole criminal empire. Franklin Nash is looking real quiet right now. Within hours, the board of directors at Fidelity National Bank was scrambling. By noon, investors were pulling funds, stock prices were plummeting, and government agencies were knocking on the bank's doors. By 3 p.m., the board called for an emergency meeting, and at 3:30 p.m., Shaq walked straight into their conference room. The board members were already seated when he arrived. Their faces were a mixture of panic and controlled arrogance. The polished glass table in front of them was covered with printed news articles and legal documents. Franklin Nash sat at the head of the table, stone-faced but not broken. Shaq walked in, taking his time, his presence filling the room. He didn't sit, didn't shake hands. He simply placed both hands on the table, leaned forward, and let the silence stretch. Finally, he spoke. "You wanted a CEO?" His voice was deep, steady. "Well, here I am." No one dared to move. Shaq leaned back, glancing at the chaos in front of them. "Looks like we got a mess to fix." Nash exhaled through his nose. "You think this changes anything?" Shaq smirked. "I think it changes everything." A younger board member, Robert Ellis, cleared his throat. "Mr. O'Neill, with all due respect." Shaq cut him off. "Number no respect. Not after what you all pulled." His eyes scanned the room. "I have proof of every shady deal you've run through this place. You think I won't use it?" Silence. "You all put my name on those documents thinking I wouldn't notice," Shaq continued. "You wanted a face the public could trust while you ran your scams in the background, and when things went south, I was supposed to be the fall guy." He leaned in again. "But that's not how this is gonna go." Nash finally spoke, his voice calm but sharp. "You think you're in control here, Shaquille?" He tilted his head. "You don't understand how this game works. You may have exposed a few leaks, but the system? The system always survives." Shaq studied him for a long moment. Then, with a slow smile, he slid a single document across the table. Nash glanced down at it, and for the first time, his expression changed. Because this document, it wasn't about him, it was about the board. The leaked internal memos, signed contracts, wire transfers, proof that the entire board was complicit. One by one, the other members realized what they were looking at. The balance of power shifted. Shaq sat down, his voice cool and even. "Now, here's how this is going to go. You're all going to resign." More silence. Shaq continued. "I take over, for real this time. And Fidelity National Bank? It gets cleaned up." His gaze flicked to Nash. "Starting with you." A slow, inevitable checkmate. The room stayed silent for a long time. Then, one by one, the resignations started. By the time Shaq walked out of the building, the board was finished. And Franklin Nash. He wouldn't walk away so easily. 3 weeks later, Shaquille O'Neal was officially named CEO of Fidelity National Bank. But this time, it was on his terms. He didn't step into the role to be a corporate puppet. He wasn't here to protect the rich and powerful. He was here to clean house. First order of business, new policies, fair lending practices, no more racial profiling, transparency in transactions. Second order of business, fixing the damage the board had caused. Investors were skeptical at first. Clients hesitated. But when they saw that Shaq wasn't just another CEO in a suit, that he was actually making changes, the trust slowly started to rebuild. One person who never doubted him? Leah Simmons. She was the one who had risked everything to help expose the truth. So Shaq made sure she got what she deserved, a promotion. She walked into his office on her first day as head of internal compliance, shaking her head with a small smile. "Never thought I'd be working for you, Mr. O'Neill." Shaq grinned. "Better me than Nash, right?" She laughed. "Can't argue with that." As for Franklin Nash, his luck ran out fast. The moment Shaq leaked the documents to the FBI, Nash's entire operation crumbled. Charges came swiftly: fraud, money laundering, conspiracy. The last time Shaq saw him, he was being escorted into a federal courthouse, his expensive suit looking a lot less powerful than before. Shaq didn't say anything to him. He didn't need to. The victory spoke for itself. A month later, Shaq sat in his office, looking out at the Atlanta skyline. He had spent his whole life breaking expectations, on the court, in business, in life. And now, he had done it again. They had tried to use him. They had tried to break him. They had tried to erase him. But they forgot one simple truth. Shaquille O'Neal wasn't just another name. He was a force, and no one, no system, no corporation, no corrupt executive would ever control him again. Shaquille O'Neal walked into the bank as a customer and left as the fall guy for a billion-dollar scheme. Powerful people tried to erase him. They failed. But what if they had succeeded? What if no one fought back? This isn't just a story, it's a reminder that corruption thrives in silence, that people in power will do anything to protect themselves, and that sometimes the only way to win is to break the system before it breaks you. Want more gripping, high-stakes stories like this? Stay tuned for exclusive content, behind-the-scenes insights, and the next big story that will leave you on the edge of your seat. Subscribe now for more, and remember, always question the system.